Last time we developed the intuition behind demand and demand curves. And recall that the demand curve is a graphical representation that shows how price affects quantity demanded, with this caveat of all other things equal. Well, other things are not always equal. And these other things are what we're going to refer to as non-price determinants of demand. And when these change, the demand curve is going to shift. And so what we want to know is, what are these determinants? So the first demand curve shifter we want to consider is number of buyers. And this should be intuitive, right? If you recall, when we have individual demands, so these are all different individuals' demand curves, we can aggregate them up to get a market demand curve. And so as you increase the number of buyers, you're adding an individual demand curve over here. And when you sum that up, it's going to shift the market demand curve over. The second thing that can shift demand is income. And income can have a different effect based on the type of good. So consider two general classes of goods. You have luxury items. We'll say like a Rolex watch. And the opposite of that is non-luxury items. So something in this category might be ramen noodles. There's nothing luxurious about ramen noodles. So this is a pack of ramen. So think about how an increase in income would affect your own purchasing behavior with respect to these items. Because it's going to be different for each one, right? So for luxury items, you're probably going to buy more of them as income increases. And the non-luxury items, you're going to buy less of. So this is our intuition. So more formally, we say if income increases and we buy more of a good, then that good is what we call normal good. So these are your luxury items. And they don't have to be luxury items. Even nicer food, a nicer car, you know, maybe you upgrade to a new phone. Those are all normal goods. The opposite of that is what we call an inferior good. And it's the opposite. So as income increases, demand for inferior goods decrease. So that's things like ramen noodles. If you're a poor college student, you eat lots of ramen. But if you get a real job and can afford to eat out or go to buy nice food, you buy less. The next thing we want to consider is the price of related goods. And these fall into two broad categories. The first is what we call substitutes. And the second is what we call complements. So substitutes are things that you're okay with having one or the other. So an example would be a pen versus a pencil, or Coke versus Pepsi. They're not the same thing, but they effectively serve the same purpose. Complements, on the other hand, are things that go together. So maybe food items, hot dogs and ketchup, computers and software.
You really going to town with that turkey there?
Oh, yeah. I got a big appetite. Oh, Jerry, you got no mustard,
It's on the door.
What, this yellow stuff? No, I said mustard, Jerry. Dijon. That's do it. No. That's Bush League. Ah.
Hey, wait. What are you just going to leave it there? It's like half a pound of turkey.
No, I can't eat that. You can't eat a sandwich without Dijon.
So complements are things that are consumed together. And so as the price of a related good changes, it's going to affect demand differently based on if it's a substitute or a complement. So two goods are substitutes formally if an increase in the price of one increases demand for the other. So think about pens versus pencils. Maybe you prefer writing with a pen, but if pens increased in price, you might consider a pencil. Same with Coke and Pepsi. Maybe you prefer Coke, but if Coke becomes very, very expensive, you might be okay switching to Pepsi. On the other hand, complements, or two goods are complements if an increase in the price of one good decreases demand for the other good. So you can see the causal chain. If the price of hot dogs increases and people don't buy as many hot dogs, they won't buy as much ketchup since ketchup gets consumed with hot dogs, and so demand for ketchup falls in response to the price of hot dogs increasing. The next thing we want to consider is tastes and changes in tastes. So if societal tastes change based on trends or fads, that can shift demand. So an example is the Atkins diet, which caused an increase in the demand for eggs. Right, this was completely attributed to taste. There was no change in the price of eggs or income or any of the other factors. And the last thing we want to consider is expectations. So a great example of this is current coronavirus situation. So if people expect they might lose their job, right, or in other words, they're expecting decreased income, That might lead to fewer car sales. And this is exactly what we saw happen. So the last point I want to make is an important one. Right? I don't throw the important disclaimer around lightly. I want to emphasize the difference between quantity demanded and demand. So if this is our current demand curve and price is some price level here, P1, we can take this price over to the demand curve, hit the demand curve, and then come down to the x-axis, which tells us our quantity demanded. So this right here is quantity demanded, which is not the same thing as just demand, right? The demand curve itself, this is what we refer to as demand. And so all those things we just listed that can affect demand, number of buyers, income, price of related goods, tastes and expectations. All of these things affect demand. And alternatively, price affects quantity demanded, but not demand. So if I change the price to some new level, P2, so price decreases from P1 to P2, I do the same thing. I follow this over to the demand curve, then down to the x-axis. This gives me a new quantity demanded, but the demand curve didn't change. Now, the demand curve can change in response to one of these things we talked about. And when the demand curve shifts out, you will get a new quantity demanded even at the same price. So going back to our original P1, at our new demand curve, we get this quantity demanded. I'll call this Q1 prime. This is D prime, we'll call that. So it's important to keep all these terms straight, right? We have quantity demanded and demand. Price affects quantity demanded only. These other factors can affect demand, which can also affect quantity demanded. So again, this is something that students tend to get confused on. So if this isn't clear, I encourage you to rewatch this again, look in the book, or ask me for help, because this is an important point. So that's it for this lecture, and that's it for demand. Next time we'll get into supply.